January 1942. The North Atlantic is a graveyard. Cold waves roll over steel hulls split by torpedoes. The night sky flashes white for a heartbeat, then fades back into darkness. Somewhere beneath the surface, the metallic hum of a German U-boat engine fades into silence. Another Allied cargo ship gone. On shore, in Washington and London, the reports are merciless. Hundreds of thousands of tons lost each month. Britain's lifeline, food, oil, weapons, vanishing into black water. The Kriegsmarine calls it Der Tonnagekrieg, the tonnage war, and the Germans believe they're winning it. At the same time, halfway across the Atlantic, another war hums with a different rhythm. Sparks fly in American shipyards. Hammers ring like artillery. Men and women in hard hats, gloves, and oil-stained overalls work through the night under blazing floodlights. On the dock, a gray hull towers above them, unfinished, untested, but coming alive. Rivets replaced by welds, modules lifted by cranes like puzzle pieces falling into place. A foreman yells over the din, "Keep moving, this one's done by Friday." 4 days later, a Liberty ship slides into the sea. The Germans can't believe the reports. The industrial tide is about to turn. The early years of World War II were defined by imbalance. Germany's military machine dominated Europe. Submarines roamed the Atlantic like predators in a limitless hunting ground. Each week, convoys vanished, torpedoed without warning. Their cargo and crews swallowed by the cold. The Battle of the Atlantic, which began in September 1939, quickly became the longest continuous campaign of the war. For Britain, survival depended on the sea. Every gallon of oil, every ton of wheat, every rifle and tank part had to cross that ocean. The Royal Navy, stretched thin and battered from years of blockade duty, fought desperately to protect the merchant routes. Yet the math was brutal. The Germans sank ships faster than the Allies could build them. In 1941 alone, U-boats sent more than 2,200 Allied vessels to the bottom, over 6 million tons of shipping. Shipyards in Britain and Canada strained to replace the losses. But traditional construction methods were slow, bound by labor and craftsmanship that couldn't match wartime speed. Each ship took about 230 days to complete, almost 8 months, and in that same period dozens could be sunk. It was an equation that pointed to defeat. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it inherited not just a military challenge, but a logistical one. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood it instantly. America would not just fight with soldiers, it would fight with production. In his words, the arsenal of democracy. But the arsenal was still empty. In January 1942, the U.S. Maritime Commission calculated that to sustain Britain, Russia, and its own forces, the Allies needed to replace over 20 million tons of lost shipping within 3 years. That meant building thousands of new vessels faster than had ever been imagined. The challenge was staggering. America's shipyards were outdated, built for peace. Shipbuilding was an artisan's trade, slow, careful, expensive. Hull plates were riveted by hand, piece by piece. Engines were machined to individual specifications. Every ship was unique, which made repairs, replacements, and scaling production nearly impossible. To meet the moment, the Maritime Commission launched what it called the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. Its mission: build a standardized cargo ship that could be produced not like a vessel, but like an automobile, in volume, on schedule, and cheap enough to lose without tragedy. The blueprint came from a British design, the Empire Liberty, a basic tramp steamer modified for American industry. It was slow, boxy, and unsophisticated, powered by a simple triple-expansion steam engine. To naval purists, it was ugly. To the industrial mind, it was perfect, functional, easy to build, and capable of carrying 10,000 tons of supplies. Critics called it a ship built by the mile and cut off by the yard. Supporters called it the ship that could win the war. Yet, in early 1942, this idea still felt like fantasy. The first prototypes were under construction, and even optimistic planners expected production to take months per ship. Meanwhile, the Germans were watching. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, was confident that his wolf packs could choke the Atlantic lifeline long before the Americans could make a difference. In his war diary, he wrote, "The enemy has no answer to the submarine. What he didn't yet realize was that America's answer wasn't under the sea. It was in the factories. Across the country, new shipyards began to rise overnight. Richmond, California, Portland, Oregon, South Portland, Maine, Baltimore, Maryland, and a dozen more along the coasts and rivers. Thousands of acres of mudflats transformed into industrial cities, complete with housing, hospitals, cafeterias, and schools for welders, the man leading. This new kind of war wasn't an admiral or a general. It was a builder named Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before 1940. Kaiser had mastered something more powerful than steel: logistics. He had built dams, tunnels, and highways at record speed. He believed ships could be made the same way, by simplifying design, dividing labor, and applying assembly line discipline. His methods challenged every tradition of shipbuilding, and they would soon prove that speed, not sophistication, would determine victory at sea. The world was about to witness not the birth of a new ship, but the birth of a new way of waging war, through industry itself. Henry J. Kaiser looked at a shipyard the way a general looks at a battlefield. To him, it wasn't about rivets or hull curvature. It was about flow, time, movement, the choreography of men and machines working as one. He saw what few others could, that shipbuilding didn't need to be a craft. It could be a process. Kaiser partnered with the U.S. Maritime Commission to apply his construction philosophy to steel and sea. His plan centered on three radical principles: standardization, prefabrication, and welding. First came standardization. Instead of dozens of designs, there would be one. A simple, sturdy cargo ship that could be replicated endlessly. Every bolt, beam, and plate followed the same blueprint, the EC2SC1 class, known simply as the Liberty ship. Next was prefabrication. In traditional shipbuilding, everything was assembled in one place, one piece at a time. Kaiser turned that on its head. His shipyards built modules, entire sections of hull, bulkheads, decks, and sterns, in separate shops. These massive steel blocks were then lifted into place by cranes like parts on an assembly line. The shipyard became less like a dock and more like a factory floor. Finally, welding replaced riveting. Riveting required teams of skilled specialists, expensive, slow, and noisy. Welding, though newer and riskier, could be taught quickly to thousands of untrained workers. Welds also made ships lighter, faster to assemble, and tighter against leaks. In the first months, skeptics laughed. Engineers doubted the welds would hold under strain. Naval officers sneered at the crude design. But Kaiser's mind wasn't fixed on elegance. It was fixed on quantity. His shipyards weren't monuments. They were machines for mass production. He brought in workers from every corner of America: farmers, factory hands, immigrants, housewives. They came by the tens of thousands, drawn by posters promising good pay and patriotic purpose. By mid-1942, more than a third of Kaiser's shipyard labor force were women, many of whom had never held a torch before. They became known as Rosie the Riveters, though in Kaiser's yards most were actually welders. Training schools opened on site. Within weeks, ordinary citizens were turning out hulls that stunned the old shipwrights. Each yard ran on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Floodlights turned midnight into midday. The clang of steel never stopped. Kaiser's operation redefined industrial warfare. At his peak, he oversaw 7 major shipyards, each one capable of launching a Liberty ship every few days. From California to Maine, the rhythm was relentless. But it wasn't just about speed. It was about coordination. Railroads brought prefabricated parts from inland factories. Foundries in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Detroit turned out engines, propellers, and boilers. Even the automobile industry was drafted into shipbuilding. Chrysler and Ford producing marine engines as if they were car motors. The government backed it all with an unprecedented flow of resources. The Warshipping Administration prioritized steel allocation, fuel, and transport. The Treasury financed the costs. The Maritime Commission tracked every ton, every keel, every launch. It was national mobilization on a scale no one had ever attempted, a civilian army fighting with tools instead of rifles. By late 1942, the results began to show. The first Liberty ships rolled out in months instead of years. Each launch drew crowds, bands playing, flags waving, champagne breaking on hulls that would soon face the Atlantic's deadliest gauntlet. The Germans noticed too. Their intelligence reports in early 1943 began to change tone. The U-boat captains reported seeing new ships, faster, simpler, and seemingly endless in number. Admiral Dönitz, once confident of strangling Britain's lifeline, began to sense the tide shifting. The Allies, he wrote, were replacing ships faster than we can sink them, yet the Americans were only getting started. Kaiser wasn't content with months. He wanted weeks. His goal was to turn each shipyard into a living clockwork, to make the impossible routine. And then, in the fall of 1942, he would do something that left even his own engineers stunned. A record so extreme that even the Germans thought it was propaganda. A ship that would rise, weld and sail in just over 4 days. They came from everywhere. Teenagers from Midwest farms, dockhands from New York, mothers who had never worked outside their homes, black laborers from the South, Native Americans, immigrants, veterans of the Depression, all standing shoulder to shoulder under the roar of cranes. The shipyards of 1942 didn't look like America's old factories. They were America, reshaped, unified, determined. The Richmond Kaiser shipyards alone, the population exploded from 20,000 to over 100,000 almost overnight. Whole new towns were built around them. Schools, hospitals, dormitories, even daycare centers so mothers could weld through the night. For many, it was the first steady job they'd ever had. For others, it was the first time they were treated as equals in a national effort. Women learned to handle welding torches with precision. Their gloved hands guided molten lines of light across steel plates taller than houses. Men who had never seen the ocean now helped build the ships that would cross it. The sound of construction became the heartbeat of the home front. Hammers, grinders, pneumatic riveters, a constant rhythm of resistance. Paychecks were good, but pride was better. They knew what each ship meant. One more chance for Britain to eat. One more convoy that wouldn't vanish beneath the waves. And behind every finished hull, there was a sense of personal victory. Workers would carve initials into hidden spots, inside bulkheads or under deck beams, a quiet mark of defiance against the enemy. It was a message that would sail across the Atlantic long after they'd gone home. These people were not soldiers, yet they fought with every spark they struck. Their battleground was steel, their weapon was speed. Before the Liberty ship, steel ships were riveted. Thousands upon thousands of metal bolts hammered by hand, sealing every joint. It was reliable but slow. Each rivet took 2 or 3 men, one heating, one placing, one hammering. For a single ship, there could be 7 million of them. Kaiser's engineers realized that if America wanted to beat the U-boats, it couldn't outfight them. It had to outbuild them. Welding became the answer. Welding fused steel directly, eliminating the need for rivets. It required fewer workers and could be done faster, but it also introduced new risks. Poor welds could crack in cold water. Early Liberty ships suffered from brittle fractures, sometimes splitting in two without warning in frigid North Atlantic temperatures. To solve it, engineers experimented relentlessly. Metallurgists adjusted the composition of steel, learning to balance strength with flexibility. Welding schools opened in every major shipyard, training tens of thousands of new hands in a matter of weeks. What had once been an expert craft became a national skill. The shift from rivets to welds changed everything. A process that had taken hundreds of days now took dozens. Entire hulls could be assembled like puzzles, with sections sliding into place on massive gantries. Factories began producing pre-welded parts inland, deckhouses, boilers, bulkheads, and shipping them by rail to coastal yards. It was the industrialization of the ocean. By 1943, the welding torch had replaced the hammer as the symbol of shipbuilding. The glowing arcs at night looked like fireflies swarming in steel caverns, tens of thousands of lights working in unison. Welding not only sped up the war effort, it changed industry forever. It taught the world that ships, tanks, even aircraft could be built like machines, in parts, on lines, and in massive numbers. The Liberty ship was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be enough, and because of its simplicity, it became unstoppable. The U-boats could sink a few dozen a month. America was soon launching hundreds, The human hands and technological leaps that powered those shipyards were two sides of the same miracle, ordinary people mastering new tools to defy annihilation. And in the offices above those roaring docks, a small group of planners watched the numbers rise, not just in production, but in morale. For every Liberty ship launched, confidence grew. For every convoy that survived, hope hardened into belief. That belief had a name: Henry J. Kaiser, the man whose willpower turned chaos into order and industry into strategy. Henry J. Kaiser didn't wear a uniform, but he commanded an army of welders, engineers, and dreamers. His leadership was not built on hierarchy, but on momentum. "Don't fight the problem," he once told his managers. Decide it, Kaiser saw inefficiency as the enemy. If a process took 10 steps, he found a way to make it 5. If workers had to walk 50 yards to fetch a tool, he built the tool rack beside them. His shipyards ran like clockwork, materials arriving just as they were needed, modules swinging into place on minute-by-minute schedules. He encouraged innovation from the ground up. Welders, foremen, and line supervisors were invited to suggest improvements, and many did. The design of welding jigs, cranes, and modular fixtures evolved daily. Mistakes weren't punished. They were studied and corrected. That mindset, rare in wartime bureaucracy, made the difference. Kaiser's secret weapon was morale. He believed production and humanity could coexist. Every yard had on-site cafeterias, safety officers, and medical facilities. He even introduced health insurance for workers, the first large-scale model of what would later become Kaiser Permanente. He understood something fundamental. People built faster when they believed they mattered. To Washington, Kaiser's results were staggering. Where traditional shipyards managed 1 or 2 launches per month, his produced dozens. At Richmond, the yards built 747 ships in less than 4 years, more than the entire Japanese fleet lost in the war. The government soon treated him as a national asset. Reporters called him America's miracle man. Yet Kaiser shrugged off praise. He insisted it wasn't genius, it was organization. He had simply taken America's restless energy and given it direction. As 1942 rolled into 1943, the machine he built was unstoppable. The numbers told the story: 1 ship every 10 days, then 7, then 5. But his engineers weren't satisfied. They wanted to see how far the process could go before it broke. That experiment would soon create a legend. In Berlin, the reports arriving from the U-boat fleet began to read like riddles. Convoys that should have been crippled were now fully replenished within weeks. U-boats sank 20 ships, and 25 replacements appeared within the same month. German intelligence analysts, reading intercepted Allied transmissions, were baffled. One report from early 1943 mentioned that American shipyards had launched 1 cargo vessel every few days. The German Naval High Command dismissed it as exaggeration, perhaps propaganda to raise Allied morale. But then the confirmation came. From neutral sources, from spies in South America, from shipping registries, the numbers were real. Liberty ships were appearing faster than ever imagined possible. Admiral Karl Dönitz was furious. His strategy, the tonnage war, was built on a single principle: sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. It had worked in 1941 and early 1942, when Britain teetered on the edge of starvation. But now his mathematics failed him. Even at peak strength, his U-boats couldn't keep up. The enemy he faced was no longer measured in ships and guns, but in production lines. In his war diary, Dönitz wrote grimly, "The enemy's industrial capacity is boundless. We destroy 1 ship, and 2 more take its place." German propaganda tried to downplay it, but the truth spread quickly through naval circles. The once feared U-boats now faced an ocean that was becoming crowded with Liberty ships, armed, organized, and escorted by destroyers made possible by the same industrial miracle. To German sailors, it seemed like magic. To the Americans, it was simply math, multiplied by steel, sweat, and sleepless nights. Beyond the numbers and metal, there was something deeper driving the Liberty ship miracle: belief. America had entered the war not only to defeat an enemy, but to prove that democracy could fight with the same discipline and force as dictatorship. The Liberty ships embodied that principle. They weren't glamorous or elegant. They were functional, egalitarian, and made by everyone. A welder in Oregon could point to a ship at sea and say, "I helped build that." It gave millions a tangible role in the war, not through slogans, but through labor. Each hull launched was a declaration of defiance against tyranny, against despair, against the idea that free societies were too slow or too divided to fight. The Germans had bet that totalitarian efficiency would triumph over democratic chaos. The Liberty ship proved them wrong by uniting thousands of ordinary people, men and women, black and white, skilled and unskilled. America showed that freedom itself could be organized into power. When the first ships returned from successful Atlantic crossings, the sense of vindication was electric. Newspapers carried headlines like, "Ships that beat the U-boats." Photographs of women welders and ship launches filled front pages. Children in schools collected scrap metal to help build another liberty. The miracle was not just in what they built, but in what they believed, that a nation of individuals could become a single force when it mattered most. That belief would soon face its greatest test, because in the months ahead, Henry Kaiser's dream of ultimate speed would become reality. A single ship would rise from blueprint to sea in just over 4 days, an achievement so unreal it left the Germans, and even America itself, astonished. By the autumn of 1942, the great American shipyards were no longer experimental. They were roaring, coordinated war engines. Steel arrived by rail in endless streams. Cranes swung in practiced arcs, and thousands of men and women moved as if to a single pulse. Every yard was racing toward one goal: build faster, build more. Henry J. Kaiser had already broken every shipbuilding record in history, but that wasn't enough. In October, he announced an internal challenge to his engineers at the Richmond Yard No. 2 in California. He wanted to see how quickly a Liberty ship could be built, from the laying of the keel to the launch into open water. The previous record stood at about 2 weeks. Kaiser wanted days. His team was skeptical. Schedules were already tight. Materials were stretched thin. Welding crews were exhausted from triple shifts. But Kaiser had seen what discipline and rhythm could do. "We've been at war for a year," he told his foreman. "Now it's time to show it." On November 8, 1942, the same day Allied troops landed in North Africa, construction began on the Robert E. Peary, Liberty ship hull number 440. The challenge was public. The press was invited. The Maritime Commission observed. The stopwatch started. The keel was laid at dawn. Sparks burst instantly from hundreds of torches. There were no delays, no pauses. Teams had practiced the sequence for weeks like soldiers drilling for battle. Prefabricated sections arrived by truck and rail, stacked in order beside the slipway. Cranes lowered entire hull blocks into place while welders sealed the seams in minutes. For 24 hours, the shipyard never slept. Workers moved in waves. As one shift stepped away, another stepped in, guided by the same lamps and floodlights. Kitchens ran day and night, serving meals directly on the scaffolds. Radio stations across California reported hourly updates. The country listened in disbelief. By the second day, the ship's hull was complete. By the third, her engines were installed. By the fourth morning, her superstructure stood tall against the rising sun. A steel giant where there had been nothing but blueprints less than a week before. At 4:15 in the afternoon on November 12, 1942, the Robert E. Peary slid into the San Francisco Bay, finished, fitted, and ready for sea. 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes after the first steel plate was laid, crowds gathered on the docks. Bands played. Kaiser himself stood silently as the ship entered the water, her bow cutting through the tide like a blade. Reporters scrambled to confirm the numbers. Engineers shook their heads in disbelief. The New York Times called it a manufacturing feat without precedent. The Germans refused to believe it. Axis intelligence agencies dismissed the report as Allied exaggeration. No one in Berlin could conceive of a ship being built faster than a torpedo could cross the Atlantic, but the Peary was no illusion. Within weeks, she was loaded with cargo and sailing for the war zone. Her voyage was uneventful, which was the point. She had proven that America could build ships faster than they could be sunk. Kaiser's experiment had become prophecy, and Washington took note. The War Production Board demanded that every shipyard adopt the Kaiser model. Prefabrication became national policy. Shipbuilding schedules were redrawn, supply chains synchronized, and factory production prioritized for Liberty ship components. What had begun as a challenge became a doctrine. Industrial warfare perfected. The momentum spread like fire. Shipyards in Baltimore, Portland, and Savannah began competing for speed records. The Joseph N. Teal followed, completed in just 10 days. Then Joseph M. Terrell in 7. The rhythm became unstoppable. For every launch, there was ceremony. But behind the music and speeches, a silent truth emerged. This was no longer about pride. It was survival. Each new ship meant food for Britain, fuel for Africa, tanks for Europe, and blood for the war that would soon reach the shores of Normandy. As winter settled over the Atlantic, the convoys began to thicken once more. German U-boat commanders, scanning the horizon through periscopes, found their hunting grounds crowded. The ocean, once empty, was filling with steel hulls, each one born from that same furious rhythm that began with the Peary. The age of scarcity was ending. The age of unstoppable production had begun, and the Germans, for the first time, began to feel what the British had once felt, a sense of inevitability. By early 1943, Liberty ships were no longer symbols of industrial hope. They were the backbone of Allied survival. The shipyards that had once seemed experimental were now operating at mechanical precision. In some, a ship's keel was laid every day, steel never cooled. Cranes moved in arcs so rehearsed they seemed choreographed. Rail lines poured in prefabricated sections like blood into a living organism. Every dock glowed under floodlights, turning the night into a second day. Across the Atlantic, the results were unmistakable. The U-boat commanders of the Kriegsmarine were no longer hunting unescorted cargo ships. They were facing convoys reinforced with Liberty hulls carrying guns, depth charges, and radar. The tonnage of new shipping arriving in Britain began to exceed what the Germans could destroy. In the spring of 1943, Allied convoys began pushing through the mid-Atlantic gap, the Black Pit, once the most dangerous stretch of ocean. Liberty ships, freshly launched from American coasts, led those formations. They carried food, trucks, tanks, and fuel for the growing armies in North Africa and Europe. Each convoy became a moving city of steel. Ships like John W. Brown, Jeremiah O'Brien, and Robert E. Peary steamed in long lines under air escort, their decks manned by volunteer naval gunners. It was not elegance that defined them, but persistence. They were slow, noisy, and plain, yet they arrived. By mid-1943, the statistics told a story no admiral could deny. In just 1 year, America had launched more than 1,400 Liberty ships, nearly 4 million tons of cargo capacity. That meant that for every ship sunk, more than 2 were being launched. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once been Germany's greatest advantage, was turning against them. Admiral Dönitz saw the shift firsthand. His U-boats, once triumphant, now faced constant detection. Allied aircraft patrols from newly established bases in Greenland and Iceland closed the mid-ocean gap. Radar and sonar improvements, carried aboard many Liberty ships, gave early warnings of approaching submarines. The hunters had become the hunted. In May 1943, the German Navy suffered what they called Black May. In a single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed, a catastrophic loss. Dönitz ordered his submarines to retreat from the North Atlantic. For the first time in the war, the Allied convoys sailed with confidence. The heart of that turnaround was not a new weapon or secret code. It was industrial tempo, ships arriving faster than fear. Each Liberty ship represented not only cargo, but continuity, a promise that the lifeline would never again be severed. The German strategy of strangulation had failed. The men who sailed the Liberty ships knew what they represented. Merchant marine crews faced brutal conditions, freezing seas, isolation, and the ever-present threat of torpedoes. Yet morale grew. The sailors believed in the ships they manned, and in the miracle of how fast they appeared. Many would write home proudly, "Ours was launched last month, they're already building another." By late 1943, new classes of vessels, the larger Victory ships, began to follow. Using lessons learned from the Liberty program, But it was the Liberty ship that carried the war through its darkest years. When Allied commanders began planning the invasion of Normandy, the logistics tables all depended on them. Without Liberty ships to haul tanks, fuel, and ammunition across oceans, D-Day could not have existed. Every landing craft, every jeep, every ration tin, they all crossed the sea inside a Liberty hull, and in the archives of German intelligence the bewilderment was complete. Their analysts could not fathom the scale. Reports described America as an industrial empire of motion. No matter how many ships the U-boats claimed, the ocean seemed to refill itself overnight. For the first time since the war began, the strategic initiative shifted irreversibly. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was a highway, from San Francisco to Belfast, from Portland to Liverpool. The Liberty ships steamed day and night, their engines pounding like the pulse of a continent at war. The weapon that defeated the U-boats was not a destroyer or a depth charge. It was the assembly line. And from that point forward, Germany's war machine would be fighting an enemy it could no longer outproduce. The tide of war had turned. But every tide leaves wreckage behind, and the aftermath of this industrial miracle would prove as revealing as its triumph. By the end of 1943, the Liberty ship program had become one of the most astonishing industrial achievements in human history. What had begun as an emergency measure, a desperate response to a naval crisis, evolved into a system so vast that it reshaped the very definition of warfare. In total, 2,710 Liberty ships were built between 1941 and 1945. The average construction time dropped from 230 days to just over 40. At peak production, shipyards were launching one every 3 to 4 days, a rhythm unheard of in maritime history. They formed the arteries of Allied logistics. Every bullet, every ration, every gallon of aviation fuel that crossed the Atlantic, much of it rode in a Liberty hull. These ships delivered tanks to North Africa, supplies to the Soviet Union through the icy Murmansk route, and troops to every front of the global war. Without them, victory would have been unthinkable, but the miracle came at a cost. Behind the statistics lay exhaustion and sacrifice. Shipyard workers endured relentless pressure. Many worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, under heat, noise, and danger. Accidents were common: burns, falls, crushed limbs. At the height of production, more than 1,000 workers a month were injured across America's shipyards. Yet absenteeism remained low. Patriotism and pay kept them at the line. The welders, the true artisans of the Liberty fleet, often bore the scars of their work. Faces weathered by sparks and smoke, hands thickened by heat and strain. In interviews years later, they spoke with pride, not regret. They had built the ships that fed the soldiers who freed Europe. Even the ships themselves bore the marks of rushed production. Some were brittle, a few fractured in cold seas. Metallurgical flaws and rapid welding occasionally led to catastrophic failures. Between 1943 and 1944, nearly 200 Liberty ships suffered structural cracks, a reminder that speed always exacted a toll. Engineers learned and adapted, improving designs, altering steel compositions, and reinforcing hulls. The lesson: even miracles have limits. Still, the ships endured. Some made a dozen Atlantic crossings under constant threat of torpedoes. Others were sunk on their first voyage, often within sight of land. More than 200 Liberty ships were lost to enemy action, and with them thousands of merchant sailors. Their casualty rate rivaled that of frontline infantry. Yet for every loss, another ship waited on the slipway. That was the unbreakable rhythm of the Liberty program, a rhythm that even death could not slow. In Washington, planners saw the proof of concept ripple outward. Aircraft factories, tank plants, and ammunition depots adopted the same principles: prefabrication, modularity, standardization. Kaiser's model became the blueprint for the entire wartime economy. President Roosevelt, visiting a shipyard in 1943, marveled at the scale of the operation. "The men who build these ships," he said, "may never see battle, but they shorten the war by every hour they work." For Germany, the consequences were devastating. The U-boat fleet, once the pride of the Reich, had been broken by numbers. By 1944, Even with improved torpedoes and tactics, they could not stem the flood of Allied shipping. Liberty ships carried not only goods but inevitability, a physical manifestation of Allied endurance. As the war turned toward its final years, the Liberty ship stood as both a triumph and a warning. Triumph for what free industry could accomplish, warning of what unrestrained production could consume. Steel, labor, and willpower had been pushed to their limits. America had proven that industrial might could become a weapon as decisive as any bomb or battleship. But what happens when the war ends, and those weapons of production no longer have an enemy to fight? That question awaited the world as 1945 approached, when victory brought peace, and peace brought redundancy. When the war finally ended in 1945, the oceans were no longer battlefields. The convoys that once sailed under blackout now moved in daylight. The Liberty ships, born of crisis and welded in urgency, had carried the Allies to victory. But with peace came an entirely new question: what to do with the fleet that had saved the world? Over 2,400 of them survived the war. Some were worn, rusted, their welds stretched thin from years of overwork. Others had never even left their shipyards before the surrender was announced. The U.S. government suddenly found itself with an armada of steel giants and no war left to fight. Many Liberty ships were sold to commercial operators for pennies on the dollar. They became freighters, grain carriers, even floating warehouses. Their boxy hulls and vast holds made them ideal for post-war reconstruction, hauling food to starving Europe, materials to rebuild bombed cities, and refugees to new lives. In a sense, they continued their mission, not of war, but of recovery. Others were mothballed in what became known as the National Defense Reserve Fleet, quiet anchorages along rivers in Virginia, California, and Texas filled with silent gray hulls lined up in rows, ghost fleets of a past emergency. They waited there, engines sealed, decks quiet, for wars that never came. Some would sit for decades, slowly rusting in the sun. A few found new purposes. Converted into hospital ships, training vessels, or power stations, the SS John W. Brown and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, two survivors, were preserved as living museums, reminders of a time when America's might was measured in steel tonnage and human resolve. Both still sail today, their engines echoing the sounds of 1943, living artifacts of an industrial miracle. Yet behind their triumph lay a deeper transformation. The Liberty program had permanently changed how the world built things. Shipyards that once took years to produce a single vessel now built dozens in a month. The methods, modular fabrication, just-in-time supply, welded assembly, became the foundation for post-war industry. Civilian shipbuilding, housing, automobile manufacturing, even aerospace adopted the same logic. In Europe, where cities lay in ruins, this American-style production became the model for recovery. Nations rebuilt using the same principles that had built the Liberty fleet: efficiency through repetition, unity through coordination. For the workers who had powered the miracle, the end of the war was bittersweet. The shipyards emptied almost overnight. Sirens that once marked the start of shifts fell silent. Many men returned to their hometowns. Many women, having proven their skill, were told to return to domestic life. The urgency was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of peacetime. Henry Kaiser, however, didn't stop. His wartime experience had taught him that logistics and humanity could coexist. He carried his ideas into peacetime, founding new industries, expanding his health plan into a full medical system, and helping shape post-war America's infrastructure. His philosophy, that production could be both humane and relentless, became a cornerstone of American industry. For Germany, the aftermath was a grim mirror. The U-boat pens stood empty. The Atlantic, once their domain, was ruled by the ships they had once mocked as crude and temporary. In post-war interrogations, several German officers admitted that the Liberty ships had broken the back of the U-boat war. No other single weapon had undone their strategy so completely. By 1947, Liberty ships carried nearly half of the world's merchant cargo. They became symbols of endurance, of how simplicity can overpower complexity when multiplied by will. But time, as always, eroded even steel. By the 1960s, most Liberty ships were gone. scrapped, sunk, or broken apart for metal. Yet their legacy endured, not in the few that remain afloat, but in the idea they represented, that the true strength of a nation lies not in its weapons, but in its capacity to build faster than fear. The clang of the shipyards had faded, but its echo remained, a sound that had changed the course of the Second World War, and perhaps the course of history itself. The Liberty ship was never meant to be remembered. It was designed to be ordinary, disposable, replaceable, unremarkable. Yet in its plain steel hull lay one of the most extraordinary truths of the 20th century, that the power to build could be as decisive as the power to destroy. Each Liberty ship carried not just cargo but conviction that democracy, with all its chaos and compromise, could outproduce tyranny, that ordinary people, factory workers, mothers, immigrants, farmers, could, through sheer collective will, forge a weapon stronger than fear. They were the humblest ships in history, and yet they did something no battleship ever could. They connected continents. They sustained nations. They made possible every campaign that followed, from the deserts of Africa to the beaches of Normandy. When the last Liberty ship slipped into rust and memory, they left behind something greater than metal. They left behind a blueprint for resilience, for unity, for what a free people can achieve when they decide that defeat is unacceptable. Standing aboard one today, hearing the steady rhythm of its old engine, one can almost feel that pulse again, the heartbeat of a nation that refused to slow down. The weld lines along its deck tell a story written not by generals or admirals, but by hands that believed every spark mattered. The Germans called them ugly ducklings. History remembers them as something else, the workhorses that turned the tide. From the ashes of the Atlantic, they rose one after another every 4 days, a rhythm of defiance that drowned out despair. In the end, the Liberty ship was not just a vessel of war. It was proof of what happens when humanity chooses to build. Even in the darkest hour, and in that relentless hammering of steel against silence, the world discovered a new kind of power, the power of ordinary people, united by purpose, welding hope into history.